At 66 years old, Vivian Hale learned the price of trust. Not in a philosophy class, not from a book, not from the kind of wisdom that arrives gently through experience and reflection. She learned it in a courtroom on a Wednesday in October, sitting across from the man she'd been married to for 41 years, watching him smile at a woman half his age, while his attorney divided Vivian's life into two columns, what she would keep and what she would lose. The what she would lose column was long, the four-bedroom colonial in Edgewater, Connecticut, valued at $1.2 million, the investment accounts totaling $840,000, the vacation property in the Berkshires worth $380,000. The two vehicles, the club memberships, the furnishings, the art collection Douglas had curated over 20 years with the meticulous eye of a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. In total, the life Vivian and Douglas Hale had built over 4 decades was worth approximately $2.8 million, and Douglas's attorney had arranged for roughly $2.4 million of it to end up on his side of the table. The what she would keep column had 2 items. Item 1, a lakefront property at 19 Pine Cove Road, Lake Winslow, New Hampshire. A 3-acre parcel with a 1-room cabin and a rotting dock, inherited by Douglas from his father, Leonard Hale, who had died in 2003. The property had been appraised at $47,000, most of that being the land value, since the cabin was condemned and the dock was actively collapsing into the lake. Douglas's attorney had argued, successfully, that giving Vivian this property constituted a fair portion of her settlement, since it represented approximately 2% of the marital estate. The judge, who was 38 years old and had never been divorced and had clearly never stood on a rotting dock in New Hampshire in October, agreed. Item 2, a brass compass, not a metaphorical compass, an actual brass compass, approximately 4 inches in diameter, housed in a tarnished case with a hinged lid. It had belonged to Leonard Hale, Douglas's father, and had been sitting in the back of Douglas's desk drawer for 20 years. Douglas's attorney mentioned it as an afterthought during the property discussion. There's also a navigational compass associated with the lake property. My client has no interest in retaining it. No interest? Of course he had no interest. It was a tarnished brass disc that didn't work properly. The needle didn't point north. It pointed northeast, consistently, stubbornly, regardless of which direction you faced. A broken compass from a dead man's drawer. The final insult in a divorce that had been a master class in calculated humiliation. Vivian sat in that courtroom and held the compass in her lap, its cold weight pressing through the fabric of her skirt, and she did not cry. She had used up her tears months ago in the dark of the bedroom at 3 a.m., discovering emails between Douglas and a 34-year-old marketing consultant named Alexis, emails that described Vivian as the old house that needs to be sold before we can move into the new one. She had cried then, devastatingly, the kind of crying that empties everything. She would not give Douglas the satisfaction of seeing it happen again in a room full of strangers. "Is the settlement acceptable to you, Mrs. Hale?" the judge asked. Vivian looked at Douglas. He was 68, gray-haired, handsome in the way that money makes men handsome, wearing a suit that cost more than the cabin she'd just been given. Alexis sat in the gallery behind him, legs crossed, phone in her hand, already bored by the proceedings because the outcome had been arranged months ago. "It's acceptable," Vivian said, "because fighting it further would have cost money. She didn't have to a system that didn't care." She walked out of the courtroom with a condemned cabin, a broken compass, and 41 years of marriage, reduced to a folder of documents she carried in a tote bag from a grocery store because she no longer owned luggage that cost more than $20. If you've ever lost everything to someone who promised to protect you, if you've ever walked out of a building carrying what's left of your life in a bag, if you've ever held something broken in your hands and wondered whether the breaking was the end of the story or the beginning of a different one, then stay with me, because what Vivian found when she followed that broken compass to the place it was trying to point her is the reason this story is still being told today. Welcome to Hearts Don't Rust. Subscribe now, because the needle on that compass didn't point north for a reason. And when Vivian Hale finally understood what Leonard Hale had been trying to tell her from beyond the grave, she fell to her knees on the shore of a lake in New Hampshire, and understood that some men hide their love so well that only the right woman can find it. Vivian Margaret Hale, born Vivian Margaret Cross, grew up in Essex, Connecticut, the middle daughter of a commercial fisherman and a woman who ran the town's only fabric shop. She was, by her own description, an ordinary girl in an ordinary town, the kind of girl who got B's in school and C's in math and A's in the subjects nobody counts, like kindness and reliability and showing up when you said you would. She graduated Essex High School in 1976, took a job as a receptionist at a real estate office in Old Saybrook, and expected to live a quiet life near the water, because the water was where she'd grown up and where she felt most like herself. She met Douglas Hale at a cocktail party in 1982. She was 24. He was 26, fresh out of Yale Business School, working for a brokerage firm in Hartford, and radiating the particular confidence of a man who had been told since birth that the world was his and had never had reason to doubt it. Douglas was from old Connecticut money, not extreme wealth, not Vanderbilt level, but the comfortable inherited kind that shows in the quality of shoes and the ease with which a person orders wine. His father, Leonard, had been a professor of marine biology at the University of New Hampshire, a quiet, scholarly man who spent his summers at a cabin on Lake Winslow, studying freshwater ecosystems, and his winters writing academic papers that were read by approximately 40 people worldwide. Leonard was the opposite of Douglas in every way that mattered, gentle where Douglas was sharp, humble where Douglas was ambitious, content where Douglas was hungry. Douglas proposed to Vivian after 11 months. She said yes because she loved him, or she loved who she thought he was, which at 24 amounts to the same thing. They married in June of 1983 at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Essex, 180 guests, a reception at the yacht club, honeymoon in Bermuda. Leonard Hale attended the wedding alone, his wife having died of cancer 2 years earlier. He danced with Vivian during the father-daughter dance substitute, since Vivian's own father had died the previous year. He was a terrible dancer, but a wonderful man, and he whispered something in Vivian's ear during their waltz that she wouldn't fully understand for 41 years. If you ever need to find your way, Vivian, don't follow the crowd. Follow the compass. It always points to what matters. She'd laughed. She thought he was being poetic. Old professors say things like that. The marriage lasted 41 years on paper. In practice, it lasted about 15. The first 15 years were genuine. Vivian and Douglas bought the house in Edgewater. Vivian decorated it. Douglas earned. They didn't have children, not by choice, but by biology, a grief they carried differently. Vivian mourned openly. Douglas treated it as a logistics failure and redirected his energy into acquisition. The Berkshire's house, the investments, the art. Over time, the house filled with expensive objects and emptied of warmth. Vivian kept trying. She maintained the garden. She hosted dinner parties for Douglas's clients. She volunteered at the library, the hospital, the Humane Society. She sat on 3 non-profit boards. She made the house beautiful, the way women make things beautiful when beauty is the only language they're allowed to speak. Douglas traveled. Frequently. Increasingly. Business trips that extended into weekends. Conferences that required evening events. He always had a reason. Vivian always accepted the reason because accepting was easier than investigating, and investigating was easier than knowing, and knowing was easier than leaving. She found out about Alexis in March of the previous year, not through detective work or intuition, but through carelessness. Douglas left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, logged into an email account Vivian didn't know existed. The emails went back 18 months. They were explicit in ways that didn't need to be described, and dismissive in ways that did. Douglas called Vivian the old house. Alexis called her the situation. They discussed timelines for the divorce, the way project managers discuss milestones. By Q3, Douglas wrote, meaning by September, meaning in 6 months, meaning the date had already been chosen before Vivian even knew she was leaving. She confronted him that evening. Douglas didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He poured himself a scotch, sat down in the living room he'd furnished with $40,000 worth of chairs, and said, "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time. I've spoken with an attorney. I think we can do this civilly." Civilly! The word hung in the air like smoke from a house that was already burning. The divorce took 7 months. Douglas's attorney was a $750 an hour specialist in high-net-worth dissolution. Vivian's attorney was a woman from New Haven who charged $200 an hour and did her best, but was outgunned from the first filing. The settlement was what settlements are when one side has money and the other side has fairness. Money won. Douglas kept $2.4 million. Vivian got a condemned cabin and a broken compass. Leonard Hale's property at 19 Pine Cove Road had been in the family since 1978, when Leonard bought the land and built the cabin himself as a research station for his lake studies. It was a one-room structure, maybe 400 square feet, with a stone fireplace, a tin roof, and a porch that faced the lake. Leonard had spent every summer there for 25 years, studying the freshwater ecology of Lake Winslow, documenting fish populations, water chemistry, plant species, sediment layers. He was a man who paid attention to things the world walked past, and the cabin was a monument to that attention. When Leonard died in 2003, Douglas inherited the property and immediately forgot about it. He'd visited once, looked at the cabin, declared it worthless, and never returned. He paid the property taxes because not paying them would have created a legal nuisance, and legal nuisances were the only kind of mess Douglas couldn't tolerate. The cabin sat empty for 20 years. The dock, which Leonard had built from cedar planks and creosote pilings, rotted slowly, losing boards one by one to weather and ice, until by 2024 it looked like a skeleton reaching into the lake. Vivian drove to Lake Winslow 3 days after the divorce was finalized. She drove alone in a 2011 Honda Civic that Douglas had allowed her to keep because it was worth less than the cost of arguing about it. She had no plan. She had no money beyond a Social Security check of $1,620 a month, the result of sparse work history and a marriage that had kept her out of the workforce for decades. She had no family nearby. Her mother had died in 2015. Her sister lived in Oregon and sent texts on holidays. She had a condemned cabin, 3 acres, a rotting dock, and a brass compass that pointed northeast instead of north. She arrived at Lake Winslow in late October. The drive from Connecticut to New Hampshire took 4 hours, and every mile north stripped away another layer of the woman she'd been in Edgewater, the woman who hosted dinner parties, the woman who sat on boards, the woman who arranged flowers and smiled at clients and pretended not to notice her husband's phone buzzing at 11 o'clock at night. By the time she turned onto Pine Cove Road, a dirt track that wound through birch and pine to the lake's western shore, she was just Vivian. No title, no role, just a woman with a car and a compass, and the specific freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. The cabin was worse than the courtroom appraisal had suggested. The tin roof had rusted through in 3 places. The front door hung on one hinge. The floor inside was swollen with moisture, buckled in the center, covered in mold. The stone fireplace was intact, because stone doesn't negotiate with time, but the chimney cap was gone, and rain had been falling directly into the hearth for years, leaving a pool of black water and decomposed leaves in the firebox. A tree had fallen against the east wall at some point and cracked the window frame. Mice had colonized the interior with the confidence of tenants who knew the landlord was never coming back. The dock was a ruin. Of the original 30-foot length, maybe 12 feet remained, the rest having surrendered to ice and rot and the patient dismantling of lake water against wood. The pilings stood like rotten teeth, and the surviving planks groaned when Vivian tested them with her foot. She didn't walk out. She stood at the shore and looked at the water and felt the cold wind coming off the lake, and she wondered, for the first time but not the last, whether the world had been right about her, whether she really was just the old house that needed to be sold. She slept in the car that first night. The cabin was uninhabitable, and she didn't have the energy to clear even a corner of it. She reclined the Civic seat, pulled a blanket around herself, and listened to the lake make the sounds that lakes make at night. Water against rock, wind through pines, the occasional splash of something alive in the darkness. In the morning, she sat on a rock at the shore and held the brass compass in her hands. She opened the lid. The needle swung, settled, and pointed northeast. Not north, northeast. She closed it, opened it again. Northeast. She stood up, turned 90 degrees, opened it. Northeast. Always northeast. The compass was broken. A $750 an hour attorney would have confirmed it, but Vivian remembered something. Leonard at the wedding, his terrible dancing, his whispered words. Follow the compass. It always points to what matters. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing. We share stories like this every week about people who were handed the thing nobody else wanted and discovered it was worth more than everything that was taken from them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Vivian had always liked Leonard. He was the one Hale she'd felt a genuine connection with, the quiet professor who noticed things nobody else noticed, and who treated Vivian with a warmth that Douglas never quite managed. Leonard had come to Edgewater for holidays until his health declined, and every visit he'd bring Vivian a small gift. A book about New Hampshire birds, a pressed wildflower in a frame, a recipe for blueberry buckle that he'd gotten from a fisherman's wife on the lake. He never brought gifts for Douglas. Douglas didn't notice. After Leonard's death, Douglas had cleared his father's belongings with the efficiency of a man for whom sentimentality was a financial liability. Most of it went to estate sales. The compass had ended up in Douglas's desk drawer because it was brass and looked valuable, and Douglas kept it the way he kept everything, not because he wanted it, but because discarding it would have required deciding it had no value, and Douglas preferred to defer that judgment indefinitely. Now Vivian held it, turning it in her hands. The case was heavy, well made, with a hinged lid that clicked open and shut with a precision that felt deliberate. On the back of the case, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, an engraving. Small, almost invisible unless you held it at the right angle in the right light. 2 letters and a number. N-E, 340 N-E, northeast. The direction the needle pointed. 340, a number. Vivian stared at the engraving. She looked at the compass needle pointing stubbornly northeast. She looked at the lake. She looked at the dock. And she felt something shift inside her. The particular click that happens when a puzzle piece you've been holding sideways suddenly rotates and drops into place. The compass wasn't broken. It had been modified. Leonard, a man who spent his life studying ecosystems with scientific precision, had magnetized the needle to point in a specific direction, northeast, and the number 340 wasn't random. It was a measurement. 340 paces, maybe, or 340 feet, or 340 meters, a distance, a direction, and a distance. The 2 things you need to find something that's been hidden. Vivian walked to the end of the surviving dock, which pointed roughly north into the lake. She faced northeast, the direction the compass indicated. The shore curved there, wrapping around a small cove before rising into a rocky bluff covered in birch trees. She'd never walked that section of the property. Leonard's cabin was oriented toward the open lake, and the northeast shore was dense with underbrush and fallen timber. She started walking. She didn't have a measuring tape, so she counted paces, figuring her stride at roughly 2.5 feet, which would put 340 paces at approximately 850 feet, or about a sixth of a mile. The terrain was difficult. Rocks along the shoreline, slippery with moss, fallen trees that required climbing over or crawling under, underbrush that grabbed at her ankles. She was 66, wearing court shoes that had been appropriate for a Honda Civic and were absolutely wrong for a New Hampshire shoreline, and her knees ached, and her breath came hard, and she kept walking because something in the compass was pulling her forward the way a story pulls a listener, with the promise that the next step would reveal something the last step had hidden. At pace 280, the shoreline changed. The rocks gave way to a small gravel beach, maybe 20 feet wide, sheltered by the birch-covered bluff on one side and a massive granite boulder on the other. The beach was invisible from the cabin. You couldn't see it from the dock. You couldn't see it from the road. The only way to find it was to walk the shoreline from the dock, heading northeast, for exactly the distance the compass prescribed. At the back of the beach, where the gravel met the base of the bluff, there was a structure. Not a building. Not exactly. A stone wall, maybe 4 feet high and 8 feet wide, built into the base of the bluff, the way a retaining wall is built, except this wall had a door. A small wooden door, maybe 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, set into the stonework, with iron hinges and a brass latch that matched the brass of the compass case exactly. The door was weathered, but intact, protected from the worst of the elements by the overhanging bluff above. Vivian knelt on the gravel beach, her heart hammering, her court shoes ruined, her hands shaking. She reached for the latch. It was locked. A small brass padlock, tarnished green with age, hung from a hasp. She looked at the compass. She turned it over. The engraving, NE 340. She pressed on the engraving with her thumb, and she felt it give. The back plate of the compass case shifted slightly, a millimeter at most, and then slid to the side, revealing a compartment. Inside the compartment was a brass key, small, old, matching the lock on the door exactly. Vivian inserted the key. It turned. The lock opened. She pulled the door. It scraped against stone and swung outward, revealing a space behind the wall. Not a cave, not a tunnel. A room. A stone-lined room, maybe 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, dug into the bluff and lined with the same carefully placed stones that formed the exterior wall. The floor was gravel. The ceiling was low, maybe 5 feet, requiring her to duck as she entered, and the room was not empty. Against the back wall stood a wooden shelf unit, hand-built, treated with some kind of preservative that had kept the wood from rotting. On the shelves were boxes, wooden boxes, similar to the ones Eleanor found in her mother's cellar, similar to the ones that appear in every story about hidden love, because hidden love always puts itself inside wooden boxes, as if love understands that wood is the material of patience, and patience is the material of love. The first box contained journals. Leonard's journals, not the academic publications that sat in university libraries, but personal journals, leather-bound, filled with Leonard's small, precise handwriting. Vivian opened one at random and found a page dated July 14th, 1992. Vivian came to the lake today with Douglas. She sat on the dock for an hour while he made phone calls. I watched her from the porch. She was looking at the water the way I look at the water, not as scenery, but as a living thing. I think she understands this place better than my own son does. Douglas sees a property value. Vivian sees a sanctuary. I wish I could give it to her directly, but the family trust doesn't allow it. So I've started preparing something else, something that will find its way to her eventually, if my plan works, and if the compass does what I built it to do. Vivian's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the journal. She opened another. October 3rd, 1998. The room behind the beach is finished. Took me 3 summers to build it. Stone by stone, carried from the bluff above, fitted without mortar because mortar would crack in the freeze-thaw cycle, but dry stacked stone adjusts and breathes. The door is cedar, the hinges are brass, the lock matches the compass key. I've started filling the shelves, first the journals, then the rest. I don't know how long this will take or how long I have. My heart has been giving me trouble. The cardiologist uses words like progressive and manage expectations, which I think is medical language for you're running out of pages. But I have enough pages for this, enough time to finish what Vivian will need when the world does to her what I've watched it do to every woman who marries a man who values objects more than people. Vivian sat on the gravel floor of Leonard Hale's hidden room and read journal after journal, 27 of them, spanning 1988 to 2002, the year before Leonard died. Together, they told the story of a father-in-law who had seen, with the clinical observation of a scientist and the quiet grief of a man who loved his son's wife better than his son did, exactly what Douglas was and exactly what Douglas would do. Leonard had watched Douglas collect objects. He'd watched Douglas charm clients. He'd watched Douglas treat the Edgewater house like a museum, and Vivian like the docent. He'd seen the late-night phone calls, the traveling, the careful accounting that always left Vivian with less than she'd started with. He'd seen all of it, year after year from the outside, the way a marine biologist observes an ecosystem from the shore without disturbing it. And he'd prepared. Everything was about to collapse for Vivian in that courtroom. But Leonard had left her something that Douglas's $750 an hour attorney and his Yale degree and his $2.4 million settlement could never reach. Something hidden inside a bluff on a lake in New Hampshire, behind a door that only a broken compass could find, left there by a man who understood that the most valuable things in the world are the ones the powerful don't bother looking for. The second box on the shelf contained documents, a life insurance policy issued in 1995, naming Vivian Margaret Hale as the sole beneficiary. Not Douglas, Vivian. The policy was for $500,000, and it had been paid up in full before Leonard's death. The issuing company was a small mutual insurer in Vermont that Leonard had chosen specifically because it had no relationship with any firm Douglas used. The policy had been generating modest returns for 20 years. Vivian would need to contact the insurer to determine the current value, but even a conservative estimate put it well above $600,000. The third box contained bearer bonds, old ones, series from the 1980s and 1990s, the kind that function like cash and are payable to whoever holds them, no questions asked. Bearer bonds had been discontinued by the U.S. Treasury in 1982 for tax evasion concerns, but outstanding bonds continued to accrue interest. Leonard, a professor who understood how to read financial instruments the way he read lake sediment, had acquired them quietly over decades. The face values, added together, totaled $180,000. Their current redeemable value, with decades of compound interest, would be significantly higher. The fourth box contained letters, not journals, letters to Vivian, one for every year from 1988 to 2002. 15 letters, each one sealed in an envelope with Vivian's name written on the front in Leonard's handwriting. Vivian opened the first, dated January 1988, 5 years into her marriage. Dear Vivian, I hope you never read this letter. I hope my son becomes the man you deserve, and you live a long and happy life, and the compass stays in a drawer forever, and this room stays sealed behind its door until the lake swallows it. But if you are reading this, it means the thing I feared has happened. It means Douglas has broken the promise he made at that altar. It means you are alone, or nearly alone, and the world has not been kind. I want you to know that I saw you, Vivian, from the very first day at that wedding, when I danced with you badly, and you laughed, and I thought, this woman is too good for my son. I'm sorry I couldn't say that while I was alive. Fathers don't say things like that about their sons, but dead men can say anything, and I am probably a dead man by the time you read this, so here it is. You were the best thing in my son's life, and he is too small a man to know it. What I've left you here is not charity, it's compensation. It's what you earned by being decent in a family that didn't deserve your decency. Take the money. Take the bonds. Take the insurance policy. But most importantly, take the cabin. Keep it. Repair it. Live in it. Because Lake Winslow is the most beautiful place I've ever known, and you are the most beautiful person I've ever known, and the two of you deserve each other. With love that has no expiration date, Leonard. Vivian sat in that hidden room for 2 hours. She read every letter. She read them slowly, the way you read things that are written in the handwriting of someone who loved you and died before they could tell you, and every letter said a different thing, but every letter meant the same thing. I saw you. I prepared for this. You are not alone. The total value of what Leonard had hidden, the life insurance, the bearer bonds, and a separate savings account documented in the 15th letter that Leonard had opened at a credit union in Laconia, New Hampshire, in Vivian's name, funded by automatic transfers of $200 a month for 15 years, was approximately $940,000. That moment rewrote Vivian's entire understanding of the last 20 years. The man she'd danced with at her wedding, the man who brought her pressed wildflowers and bird books and blueberry buckle recipes, had spent the last 15 years of his life building her a financial fortress hidden in a bluff on a lake, accessible only through a compass he'd engineered to point the way. Vivian contacted the life insurance company from the cabin's front porch, sitting in a folding chair she'd bought for $8 at a gas station using her cell phone. The representative confirmed the policy was valid, fully paid, and had a current death benefit plus accumulated dividends of $637,000. The bearer bonds, when she brought them to a bank in Concord the following week, were valued at $247,000 with accrued interest. The credit union account in Laconia held $58,400. Combined total, $942,400. Douglas's attorney had given her 2% of the marital estate. Leonard had given her 39% of it back from beyond the grave, through instruments and accounts that existed entirely outside the divorce because they'd been established 20 years before the marriage ended, and because they weren't in Douglas's name and never had been. Vivian did not call Douglas. She did not call his attorney. She did not gloat, crow, or celebrate. She walked down to the ruined dock, sat on the one plank that still held weight, held the brass compass in both hands, and said, "Thank you, Leonard. I followed it. I found it. And I understand now." She repaired the cabin first. Not quickly, not with contractors in expensive trucks, but carefully, with local tradespeople she found by asking at the general store in Winslow Village. A roofer named Tom Paquette replaced the tin roof for $4,800 using standing seam steel that would last 50 years. An electrician named Marie Delacroix ran power from the road, installed a panel, wired the cabin for lights, and a refrigerator and a water heater for $6,200. A well driller punched a 200-foot well and hit clean water at 180 for $8,500. Vivian did the plumbing herself, watching YouTube videos on her phone and buying supplies at the hardware store in Meredith because she had never fixed a pipe in her life and saw no reason why 66 was too late to start. The cabin took 4 months. When it was done, it was still small. Still one room, 400 square feet, with the original stone fireplace now properly capped and functioning. But it was warm. It was dry. It was hers. And every morning, when she opened the front door and looked at the lake, she saw what Leonard had seen. Not a property value, but a sanctuary. Not real estate, but a living thing. She rebuilt the dock next, not the whole thing. She hired Tom Paquette's brother-in-law, a marine carpenter named Gill, who replaced the pilings with pressure-treated posts and laid new cedar planks across the surviving frame. The dock extended 20 feet into the lake now, enough to sit at the end with your feet over the water and watch the loons dive and surface, disappearing and reappearing the way truth does when it's been hidden long enough. She discovered Leonard's research. In the journals, interleaved with the personal entries, were decades of scientific observations about Lake Winslow. water temperature readings, fish population counts, plant species inventories, sediment analyses. It was a comprehensive, meticulous record of a freshwater ecosystem studied by one man over 25 years, the kind of longitudinal data set that modern researchers would consider extraordinarily valuable because nobody does 25-year studies anymore. Grant cycles are too short. Attention spans are too short. Only a man with a cabin and a compass and no interest in fame would sit on a dock for a quarter century and count the same fish. Vivian contacted the University of New Hampshire's Department of Environmental Science. She brought them 3 of Leonard's journals. The department chair, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, spent an afternoon reading them and called Vivian the next morning. "Mrs. Hale, do you understand what you have?" "I have my father-in-law's journals." "You have a 25-year longitudinal freshwater ecology data set. This kind of continuous, single-observer data doesn't exist anymore. The scientific community has been trying to reconstruct historical baselines for lakes like Winslow for decades, and your father-in-law was sitting on the most complete one we've ever seen. With your permission, we'd like to digitize the journals, publish the data, and establish the property as a research site. We would name it the Leonard Hale Freshwater Research Station." Vivian said yes. The university sent a team. They cataloged all 27 journals. They surveyed the property. They confirmed that the 3 acres included a diversity of shoreline habitats, from the rocky western shore to the gravel beach where the hidden room sat, that made it ideal for ongoing research. The university offered Vivian a partnership. They would fund the establishment of the research station, maintain the property, and provide Vivian with a small annual stipend for serving as the site's caretaker and host. The stipend was $18,000 a year, which, combined with Vivian's Social Security and the investment income from Leonard's insurance policy, which she'd placed in a low-risk fund generating roughly $25,000 annually, gave her a comfortable, modest income. Not Edgewater money, not $2.4 million money, but enough to live at the lake, maintain the cabin, and never depend on another person's accounting of what she was worth. Douglas found out in month 8, not through Vivian, through a magazine article. New Hampshire Wildlife Quarterly published a feature about the Leonard Hale Freshwater Research Station, including photographs of the cabin, the dock, the lake, and Vivian standing on the shore holding Leonard's brass compass. The article described the hidden room, the journals, the bearer bonds, the insurance policy. It described a man who had spent his final years preparing a sanctuary for his daughter-in-law because he knew his son would fail her. Douglas read the article in his living room in Edgewater, sitting in a $4,000 chair next to Alexis, who was already losing interest in him, because the man she'd found exciting during the affair was proving to be exactly as dull as the woman he'd left. He read about his father's journals, which he'd never read. He read about his father's hidden room, which he'd never known existed. He read about $942,000 in assets that had been in his father's estate and had passed directly to Vivian through instruments he'd never seen. He called his attorney. His attorney told him there was nothing to be done. The life insurance named Vivian as beneficiary directly. The bearer bonds belonged to whoever held them. The credit union account was in Vivian's name. None of these assets had ever been part of the marital estate because they'd never been in Douglas's possession. Leonard had structured everything specifically, deliberately, with the precision of a man who studied ecosystems for a living and understood that the most important thing about a system is how it behaves when it's stressed. Douglas did not call Vivian. He could not bring himself to call the woman he'd dismissed as the old house, and admit that his own father had seen her as the foundation. Vivian sits on the dock at Lake Winslow, on mornings when the water is still and the mist rises from the surface like the lake is exhaling. She holds the brass compass sometimes, running her thumb over the engraving on the back, NE 340, the coordinates of a dead man's love. The needle still points northeast. It will always point northeast. Leonard built it that way, and things Leonard built lasted. The cabin is warm. The research station is active. Graduate students come in summer to collect data. Leonard started collecting in 1978. They use his methods. They reference his journals. They sit on the dock where he sat and count the same fish he counted and add their numbers to the data set he began, extending his work year by year into a future he knew he wouldn't see, but prepared for anyway, the way he prepared everything, quietly, precisely, with the understanding that the most important work is the work that outlasts you. Vivian has not remarried. She's not opposed to it. She's simply not looking. She has the lake. She has the cabin. She has 27 journals in the handwriting of a man who saw her when nobody else did, and 15 letters that say the same thing in 15 different ways. You were always the treasure, Vivian. The compass was just the map. My heart overflows with gratitude that you stayed with Vivian through every moment of her extraordinary journey, from the courtroom where her life was divided into columns to the gravel beach where a hidden door opened into a room full of love that had been waiting for 20 years. If her story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been discarded by someone who didn't see your value, if you've ever held something broken and realized it was pointing you somewhere, if you've ever been loved by someone who couldn't say it out loud and so said it in brass and stone and patient silence, then leave just one word in the comments. One word that describes the moment you understood that being undervalued by the wrong person doesn't change what you're worth to the right one. Because Vivian's story proves something that no divorce settlement and no $750 an hour attorney can touch, that a compass doesn't have to point north to point you home, that the people who throw you away are sometimes standing right next to the person who would have given you everything, that 15 letters in a stone room on a lake are worth more than $2.4 million in a courtroom. That love, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. It hides in a bluff and waits for you to follow the needle, and that sometimes the broken thing is the only thing that works. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that the thing everybody called worthless might be the most valuable thing in the room, that a rotting dock can lead to a hidden fortune, that a dead man's compass can save a living woman's life, and that the best love stories aren't about the people who stay. They're about the people who prepare, because together we prove that hearts don't rust, that brass doesn't lie, and that sometimes the greatest inheritance is the one hidden inside something everyone else threw away. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.